Ang sinabi ko na lang, anak, impluwensyahan mo siya ha, na gumawa ng assignment. But what should a parent do?
And to think that even those goals can be transmitted from your classmates. Can speak about how much your social circle and your classroom, your social environment really matters.
Hello everyone, my name is Rene and welcome to Academic Psych PH. This is a podcast wherein I and my friend Darren talk about things about psychology, especially in the Philippine context. Good evening, Darren.
Good evening, Rene. Kamusta ka?
Mabuti naman, pre. Eto, may konting hangover pa sa recently concluded na election. So may mga nanalo na and hopefully things turn out well for the country. Kung sino man ang mga na-elect na leaders ng ating bansa.
Whether we agree or we disagree dun sa result, sana yung mga elected officers ay maging totoo dun sa kanilang oath. And we see betterment for our country.
Oo. At saka yung tagumpay naman ng country ay hindi lamang naman nakasalalay sa kanyang mga leader, kundi sa taong bayan din. No? So, ang success ng bawat isa sa atin, partly natutulungan tayo ng gobyerno, pero a large part of it is also through our own agency. So, for as long as we do good as citizens, nagbabayad tayo ng buwis, pinapangalagaan natin ang ating kapaligiran, hindi tayo nandadaya, masipag tayo sa trabaho, I believe that success is very much possible for every Filipino.
Collective yan no? Shared success. So everyone, kinakailangan magte-take part. And speaking of that, siguro dahil sa result nitong election to, marami yung nakikita mo na nangangailangan ng inspiration, something to motivate them, maybe to move forward.
Oo, tama. Marami mga nangangailangan ng inspiration. At tingin ko, hindi naman tayo kapos sa inspiration if we look at the people around us. There are a lot of people who are doing good and hopefully we get inspired by them. Katulad na lang nitong podcast na to. Matagal na nating plano na magkaroon ng podcast. Pero it took some time bago maumpisahan itong podcast na to. And thinking back, one of the reasons kung bakit nga nag-materialize itong podcast na to is because I was inspired also by somebody, a colleague of ours, a former part-time faculty in our department. So nakita ko sa kanya na nakapag-release na siya ng podcast. So naisip ko na kung kaya niya, dapat maumpisahan na rin natin itong podcast na to. So nakakatawang isipin na paminsan yung mga aspirations and goals ng ibang tao influences our own goals and aspirations. Meron bang tayong tawag na term doon on how some goals become contagious at parang nahahawa or naiimpluwensyahan ng goals ng ibang tao ang goals mo?
Palagay ko, marami tayong pwedeng itawag dun Pero dito sa episode na to, tatawagin natin yung social contagion. At syempre, opportunity na rin natin para tawagin ang ating guest for this episode.
Tawagin na natin, walang iba ang ating colleague, si Mr. Norman Medoza.
Hi Norman!
Hello, Sir Darren. Hello, good evening.
Hi
Kumusta
Norman.
ka? Mabuti naman, Sir Darren. Hello, Sir Rene.
Nasaan ka ngayon? Interested akong malaman kung nasaan ka ngayon
Nasa Hong Kong, Sir Darren, specifically affiliated sa Education University of Hong Kong.
Minsan iniisip ko, ilang taon ka na dyan?
2 years. 2 years and a half.
Marunong
Sir
ka na
Darren.
bang mag-Chinese?
Konting Cantonese kasi natutunan ko din from Macau. Na-bring up ko lang din dito na refresh ng konti.
So kanina we were introducing you, Norman, and we said that you were a part-time faculty of the Department of Psychology before you went to Hong Kong and pursue your PhD. So Norman is currently pursuing his PhD. This is not the first time that you're pursuing a PhD. If I'm not mistaken, you were well on your way to another PhD and then you stopped for a while and then pursued another PhD. Oo. Bakit? Anong nangyari? Parang feeling ko parang malaking investment yung pag-pursue ng PhD, pero bakit yung unang PhD natigil, and here you are right now. Mabuti naman that you've almost completed the program.
So Rene, that's a really good point. So yung first PhD ko started in 2016, and then I had to stop 2 years later because several reasons, but one of them being my sickly grandfather. I had to go home, and I think it was yung timing then was perfect because that was 2018, start of 2018, and then late of that year, my grandfather passed. So I had to pivot really well kasi when you start a PhD, sometimes it's about running a project,
Yeah.
and so those projects are funded, and so if mayroong sensitivity with the time, and so I had to go home and then work muna sa Holy Angel University, and then eventually joined DLSU Manila, which I really enjoyed my time there. I did not think of leaving actually until an opportunity presented itself dito nga sa Hong Kong under Dr. Ronel King. And so that was essentially the reason. But parang when that happens, you would think na parang maybe I just drop it and then just focus on my masters and then teach. Minsan, you choose research. Sometimes research chooses you. So yun na lang naging perspective ko nun, sir.
Very interesting and at the same time inspiring, no? Kasi, well, not all are given second chances, but if you were given, di ba, syempre, grab the opportunity. And dahil nasabi mo nga naman na you did not choose research, but research chooses you. Right now, ano ba yung favorite research area mo?
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, people ask me that question, tapos my studies are all over the place. I always say na parang hindi pa sila crystallized. So I have papers published validating psychological instruments or educational measures. I also have papers published for clinical psych or community mental health psych during the pandemic especially. Tapos of course, I also have yung main research area ko ngayon, which is educational psychology and assessment. But before I was all over the place, meron kaming research area ni Dr. Ronel King on social contagion, which I really like talking about because, first of all, they're not so technical. At least you can talk about them not in a non-technical way. And second of all, they are very relevant and you see them almost every day. So parang madaming life circumstances na iilaw sila na parang, oh man, that's social contagion. And then you go, oh, that's another social contagion. And so that's why social contagion research is one of the more interesting researches that I've been involved with.
Kanina, Norman, before you came in, pinag-uusapan namin ni Darren yung recent turnout ng elections dito sa Pilipinas, at nasabi namin some people seem to be in need of inspiration, of hope, and sabi namin na based on experience, sometimes we draw inspiration, we draw goals, we draw hope from other people, and to some extent I think that's what social contagion is. Although alam natin that the word contagion is more popularly associated with emotions. In the area of social psychology, contagion is oftentimes described as the spread of emotions from one individual to another, kumbaga widespread transfer of emotions. So can you describe social contagion? Can you define it and perhaps differentiate it from the contagion that we typically know, which is emotional in nature?
Tama, Sir Rene. I think you hit a lot of good points in your question, in that when we talk about social contagion, we think of inferring goals, actions, and thoughts from others, including emotions, which yung mga earlier research, mga Levy 1993, those type of researches have been really pegged on emotional contagion. When you're surrounded with people who might be having negative affect, you're also bound to have similar negative affect. The same is true if you have positive climate, positive environment. You're also likely to channel that in you. Kaya nga dun sa parang how you alluded to the elections, if you're surrounded with people who are struggling, but at the same time with positive coping, parang finding some comic relief about the elections, or just completely distracting themselves out of it by watching Netflix, and you're likely to do the same type of coping mechanisms. But one distinct characteristic of, social contagion with the more clinical and emotional contagion research is that when we talk about contagion, it's more broad. It's not just emotions. It includes even goals. One paper that we have with Dr. Ronel has achievement goal contagion. When you're a student and you have surrounded with classmates who are goal oriented in terms of mastery, which is trying to learn and master a new subject, or performance goals, which are try to be competitive and be at the top of the rank. Those are also inferred, and not only inferred, pero you're also invested in achieving that goal, in that, or yung na-infer mo na goal from others. You're so invested that if you don't achieve that goal, you'll experience negative affect. So when we talk about social contagion, it's really broad. And even I would argue, despite maybe not having existing research yet, when you're surrounded with hopeful people, I also would say that perhaps that also instill a lot of hope in you, especially yung research ni Prof. Alan, there's agency outside the individual, in that your peer, your family, even your spirituality can inculcate hope. And so very promising yung ganong research.
So far, itong mga study mo on social contagion, can you describe the results of this work and what we know so far based sa mga study na nagawa?
Well, Dr. Ronel has maybe 7, 8, maybe if not 9 papers published on this one. I'm happy to be involved in 4 of them. Yung mga papel namin are focused on the contagion of academic outcomes. 3 of them are positive and 1 more maladaptive. Yung mga positive, like I mentioned kanina about achievement goals, we found that to be transmittable between classmates, which is very interesting. We also found yung first paper namin, which was also presented in AASP in Taiwan, which was the spread of school engagement. So when students are engaged behaviorally and emotionally in school, they're likely to influence others in their classroom. Another paper that we wrote was social goal contagion. I really liked writing that paper because it talks about when people around you are pro-socially motivated, which means they care about others, you're likely to do the same. And we can talk about volunteerism. If people are volunteering, you would also likely to care about that. Tapos yung maladaptive naman is work avoidance. Essentially, work avoidance is when students tend to just maybe avoid schoolwork, which might be, prominent now, lalo na online learning. What we found was, in a research, we analyzed data from north of 1,500 students clustered from some 50 classrooms. We found that was true. When you're surrounded with people who don't want to do schoolwork, you're also likely to not do schoolwork, and not only that, you become less engaged, which is in the academic literature is called disengagement. Then I realized, nung college ako, parang ganun din. When we say, parang tara, lang tayo ng mga nagpa-practice na varsity, we just go and skip a class. I'm not saying to the listeners to skip a class, but I'm saying that your circle really influences a lot of your school outcomes.
In essence, what you're saying is that the current evidence seem to agree with the saying, tell me who your friends are and I will tell you who you are. Parang ganun ang dating. So in a nutshell, what we're saying is that our goals, whether that be achievement goals or the goal to avoid work, or even our level of engagement, is partly determined by the level of engagement and what kind of goals of the people around us. Now, I'm quite interested in terms of the methodology, in terms of how you were able to test these models. So if you can talk a bit about some of the methods that you've used in your studies, so that for those who are listening to us right now, they might also be able to visualize how they can pursue a similar study.
Great question, sir. One of the more robust methodological studies on social contagion is done by Nicholas Christakis. They even have a book published on it. Essentially what they did is they looked at a large data set. I think the title of that data set is the Framing Heart Study. And they looked at obesity being contagious. We were like, how can you analyze that? How would you say that when you are surrounded with people who might be on the higher end of the weighing scale would lead you to be obese yourself? And so what they did is actually called social network analysis, right? Where they connected one individual to another, and then those linkages, are built, and then they are what we call centrality indices, which means that, there are specific part of your network structure that would contribute to you having specific outcomes, in this case, obesity. Tapos meron din silang published na paper that shows that depression and anxiety are equally transmissible. So that is the more robust way in which, when we talk about social network analysis, you ask an individual, who are the 5 people, 7 people you spend the most time with? And then they report those, and then you analyze those outcomes and regress them onto your outcomes. So it's a classical regression analysis, but accounting for all those individuals. May mga interesting studies then where they also ask you those that you don't, like being with. It's another interesting part. So these are the distal kind of networks. So you don't like to be engaged with them. And so this would make sense in a way that, for example, if that network is smoking and you say, I don't like engaging with them, then maybe likely you're not going to engage in some tobacco use. So that's the more robust and rigorous way. In the absence of that, especially in cross-sectional studies like what we did with data, Dr. Rene and I, you may not be able to connect the dots. And so a lot of this is parang on hindsight, you can analyze the data this way. So what we did was they're clustered into classrooms. What we analyzed them is called multi-level modeling. That's the more technical term. In Stata, it's called mixed effects modeling. Because there's a cluster, right? So simple terms, there's a classroom. Let's say there are some 30 students in one classroom. What we did was to calculate the average, for example, talking about work avoidance, the average work avoidance of the 30 individuals in that classroom minus mine, right? That's our predictor. And then a few months later, maybe end of semester, we measure the same outcome again, work avoidance. And then what we do is we use that average work avoidance of my classmates to predict mine in time 2, and then controlling for what we call the autoregressive effects, which is my time 1 work avoidance. Because my time work avoidance would predict so much of my time 2. Syempre, I'm the same individual. So we're talking about 0.6, 0.7 in terms of, predictive effects no previous time 1 work avoidance, because that's me. But what we found was that the effect of my classmates' average onto my score will still be significant even if you control for my time 1 work avoidance. So that's how we conceptualize, at least statistically and methodologically, yung social contagion. And those are all robust when you talk about mixed effects and multi-level modeling. And so those were really interesting. And when you have data na clustered in nature, when they're groups, and then as an advantage, they're longitudinal, which means multiple time points, there's a lot you can do. So it's a matter of conceptualizing whether you can argue that one is contagious. And if it is, which I think 9 out of 10 psychological constructs should be contagious, then you might have the right data set to analyze.
Going back to contagion in the emotional sense, ang pinaka-classic, well, it's not really a study, pero ang pinaka-classic example ng contagion based on social psychology textbooks will be what happened in, is it the 1920s or the 1940s, yung War of the Worlds? Do you remember that? So apparently, merong radio program.
Sorry.
Apparently, may radio program sa, I'm not sure if it's in UK or the US. Ang title niya ay War of the Worlds. And I think it's based on a book, and I think that was also adapted as a movie. And so dun sa radio drama na yon, wala pang TV no? So a form of entertainment ng mga tao is radio drama. They broadcasted a fake breaking news that simulated an actual breaking news. At ang content ng breaking news is that Martians have come and is attacking planet Earth, and then meron pa silang may mga interviews, and then it seems to be very realistic na may mga siren. And what happened was that a lot of people believed the information, and when they looked around, when they peered by their window, kita nila na nagpapanik na yung buong town. So the entire town was in pandemonium, nagkagulo. Even the police officers thought that there was actually a Martian invasion. So ito yung kumbaga, classic anecdote ng spread of fear in an entire community. And so, my question is, if in emotional contagion, typically the spread is very evident to a large number of people, how does that compare to social contagion? Like, what are some of the parameters wherein we can say that this is supposedly contagion, the goal is contagious, versus a simple case of, just being inspired by a single individual, or maybe being inspired by vicarious experience. No? So when does it become social contagion?
That's a nice story. I will steal that from you, Sir Rene, if I need to share a nice story to others about social contagion. Pero ang nice about it is, it seems like that story, along with the research that I've kind of curated, is that there's some form of social influence, that you can get or transmit to others in a way that the effect is not only to you. So meron laging receiver of that. And I guess there shouldn't be, or there is not much difference, as long as the construct is transmitted to the other. You reminded me, based on that story, Sir Rene, about the Werther effect. When we talk about copycat behavior, even on suicide, that when you hear about it, specifically the means, not the discussion, because we already know that discussing suicide allows the stigma to be reduced. But when you hear about the means, which is binabawal nga ng WHO, you don't talk about how, because it's happening in terms of the Werther effect, which means the copycat behavior. And that only is one of the more negative part of contagion. But we would see that the effect is really universal, in that I would say that the parameter should be, as long as I've inferred it, or you've inferred it from me or your social environment, that should be categorized as some form of social contagion. Especially, I would argue, if you pursued what was contagious behaviorally, in that if I engaged myself behaviorally towards that behavior, that's when, at least to me, I would label it to be contagious. Kasi there's a research, for example, by Wild and Enzel. Merong silang ginawa in 2002. But this is just a book chapter, really nicely written paper. What they did was, they transmitted intrinsic motivation. So meron dalawang teacher, yung isa bayad, yung isa was just there to teach because he was personally motivated to teach. What happened was, the students of the motivated teacher were more motivated. Not only that, merong second generation motivation, in that yung mga tinuruan nila na buddies, yung mga students na nag-attend dun sa intrinsically motivated teacher, ended up being motivational tutors themselves. So it doesn't end in one node or one individual, which is to me very fascinating, na parang, it can start with one and then it can get transmitted. Much like COVID-19 pandemic, although yun nga yung problem dito, there's no binary na parang positive, negative that we can really connect, or how transmissible it is. Diba? Baka yung mga negative outcomes are more transmissible, like they're more parang, ano ba yung variant natin ngayon? What's the more recent variant ng COVID? Omicron, for example, it's like Omicron variant. Pero yung isa, let's say positive outcomes are more like Delta, more serious symptoms, but not as transmissible as Omicron. That should be the more interesting social contagion research happening now. Like, not only yung, does it transmit? You don't stop there, but how transmissible is it? And can you answer that using statistics? That to me excites me, although I don't have the methodology to answer that just yet.
So we know that it can be transmitted. The next question would be how transmissible it would be. Or maybe another question would be, under what conditions can these goals, can these constructs be transmitted? No? Kasi posibleng maraming mga moderators that can serve to enhance the transmissibility or to buffer the transmissibility.
Definitely, sir. For example, gender is one really nice moderator. Easy, binary, you can use it. Parang baka mas transmissible yung mga ganitong outcomes for women and not so much for men. Baka pagka behavioral yung outcome, mas men, pero pag mas emotional or mas psychological or cognitive, mas women. Those are all exciting frontiers for social contagion research. I definitely agree with the moderators.
Iniisip ko, Norman, pag social contagion ba dapat lagi siyang non-conscious? Ayun, you just pick it up. Pwede bang maituring na social contagion if there's a direct influence, if somebody told it to you? Pagka ganun yung transmission?
The short answer is yes. I would even argue na yung mga behavioral and observable behaviors are those that are easily transmissible, such as yawning. We know evidence for that. And the mechanisms have been established. These are a function of our mirror neurons. Yung classic research, yung sinabi nila, you watch a person dancing and your brain waves would actually show that you're actually in your head, you're trying to imitate those dance moves. And so I think observable behaviors are more transmissible, I would say, kasi kitang-kita agad sila. Kasi I think one mechanism for social contagion really is attention. So if you can see it, it's easier to copy it. And that is true for motivation, inspiration, and awe. Although yun nga, a lot of the research are focused on the non-conscious side of things, but you can try to capture them using a survey. Pero merong research, for example, Todd Thrash, he and his colleagues did this experiment wherein he asked writers to write poems. And those poems were read. And those writers who were inspired when they were writing the poem made the reader feel more inspired. Thus, a lot of other outcomes like awe, enthrallment, those are all unobservable psychological states. So they're more covert. But even those were able to be transmitted through text. Imagine you're just reading a text and you get the inspiration. So in my mind, like, if you can transmit those very important psychological and rather unconscious constructs and you feel them, parang there's so much power that can be wielded with the content people make.
I think what Darren is asking, just to clarify, is if I give direct instruction that this should be your goal, is that social contagion? Kasi in the previous studies, parang hindi naman siya direct instruction, di ba? Parang our work avoidance is influenced by the work avoidance of our classmates. But our classmates do not direct us na, uy, wag ka nang magtrabaho. Although siguro may mga ganun din, no, na parang anecdotal episodes na may naririnig kang, huwag na tayo magtrabaho. Pero I think what Darren is asking is, if it's clearly a form of direct instruction, can that be counted as social contagion?
I see. I think that's an even better question than what I was trying to answer in my head. Essentially, if the construct, behavior man yan, or cognition is told for you to do as opposed to you just passively getting it from your social environment. I get it now. Really nice question. I would say combining two constructs. We are aware of psychological reactants wherein when you're told, sometimes there's some pushback with that. So people inherently don't like being told what to do because autonomy is so important to everyone. It's a basic psychological need according to the self-determination theory. So it's so important that you are allowed to pursue your own goals. You're allowed to pursue your own behaviors. And so when you are told to, say, for example, avoid this or don't smoke, don't drink alcohol, or, don't do X and Y, that can be impinging on your need for autonomy. And so because of that, and plus the reactance angle, because of that, it's possible that when you're told to pursue a goal or do something, you might, face that with some level of resistance because autonomy wasn't there. As opposed to just seeing them do it, and you are now wielding two powers. You passively see observational learning, contagion, and plus yung conformity. Especially if you're in an interdependent culture or a cultural environment just like the Philippines, which is focused on interdependence and a lot of collective norms. I think you're wielding all of that. And so pagka hindi sinabi sa'yo yung goal, maybe there's a little bit more power than that. But I really, really, really like that question.
Nabanggit mo yung conformity. So I wonder, how can we differentiate social contagion from yung classic conformity?
It's true. That's true. That's really true. I think that there's so many similarity and overlap between the two, Sir Darren. I would only say that when it's conformity, you may even regret doing it. It's a more low-level form of contagion. It's like it's getting at you, but not really to the form that you commit. For example, you can raise your hand, yung classic conformity example. You can raise your hand, but then later on sabi mo, actually, ayoko naman talaga. It's so fast that you catch yourself being just conforming. But for social contagion, I would say that it's a little bit more potent than that instead. So you can even umbrella conformity under contagion. It's like an element of contagion. Maybe it starts with conformity and then it doesn't stop there. Parang meron pa siyang pursuance of that goal and you're really committed to that goal. Then I would call it social contagion. For conformity, it would be something like nag-milk tea yung mga kaibigan ko and then I also bought the same milk tea and then regretted afterwards because too much sugar. So I would say that would be a way I would simplify it, Sir Darren. But really nice.
Or maybe we can talk about the kind of conformity because we know that there are different kinds of conformity, right? Merong normative social influence at saka merong informative social influence. So perhaps one way that we can sort of frame it is that conformity, particularly informative social influence, can serve as a possible mechanism to contagion. No? Mamaya, we will talk about the mechanisms of social contagion. Pero dahil nabanggit yung culture, are we suggesting that in collectivist culture, kasi tanong din natin kanina, saan ba mas potent itong social contagion? Does that mean to say that for communities who are known to be collectivistic, posible kaya na mas powerful ang social contagion?
Short answer is yes. Mainly because most of my research are done sa Philippines, so more collective culture. So when you're doing peer review, they ask you, what are the cultural aspects with this? Kasi yung editors may be non-Filipino, so very interested sila, yung Hofstede scale of, how individualistic a culture is. And so they ask you that question, parang, are there cultural elements here? And my always go-to answer is like kapwa, which is a crude way to respond. It does not capture the entirety of the Filipino culture. But I would say na it's easier to surmise with rather little evidence that when you're in a culture where harmony is important and that the community, you and the others are, in unity and in oneness, you are more likely to have more urge or more kasi parang sa atin, it's not reinforced when you're different. As opposed to Western countries wherein to each his own and individuality is really emphasized. Sa atin, it's all about trying to blend in and trying to contribute. And so I would say na medyo yes siguro yung sagot ko dyan sa Sir Rene. More collectivist culture, it should be more fertile for social contagion.
So yan, panibagong research topic yan. So for those of you who are interested, you can do cross-cultural study and see if social contagion varies as a function of culture.
Na-interest din ako dun sa pinag-uusapan natin kanina na goals can also be contagious. It's interesting for me kasi goals, among others, parang ang feeling ko sa goal ay medyo conscious siya. So hindi ko alam kung is it true, are we always conscious about our goals, or can goals be something non-conscious that you pick up through social contagion?
I think they're primarily conscious, Sir Darren, because when you plan a goal, there are necessary steps to get to that goal. Yun nga yung what we looked at in our research, which are achievement goals, or for mastery, to learn a subject, performance, to do really well, that you rank really high or get really good grades. So those are more higher order goals. When those goals happen, what we know is from the evidence, they are also transmissible. We're very happy that in one paper that Andrew Elliott wrote in an APA journal, I forgot the title, but our study was cited in that journal. And we're happy that they did that because, first of all, it was appropriately cited, yung finding namin. When you're surrounded with competitive classmates aiming for performance goal, you're likely to do the same. And so that's what we know about achievement goals. So parang when we think about how higher order goals are, just like what I said kanina, and to think that even those goals can be transmitted from your classmates, can speak about how much your social circle and your classroom, your social environment really matters. So there are a lot of implications that parents can make with this, know the type of classrooms, the type of school you're sending your kids to, their friends. Of course, hindi naman like what Sir Rene mentioned kanina, the nuances, it's not that the whole classroom affects you. Diba? Meron yung best friend mo lang pala, or just your sitmate who's sitting right next to you. So there are a lot of nuances, but it's important that you, if you're the individual understudy, that you know your social environment because they can really influence your goals. And from parents sending their kids to school, yun din yung isang implications na nasulat namin doon. Even teachers, you should know as an educator who are flocking together. Sabi nga ni Sir Rene kanina, who are flocking together, and understand that really matters in the outcomes of students, including how they pursue goals in school and in learning.
May interesting question ako dyan. Kasi last week, we were preparing for this podcast. So I kind of know what the content of the podcast is gonna be. I know what the topic is. And then, recently, so yung anak ko, meron siyang classmate na parati niyang kausap. And then, sa school nila, parang may pinapadala na, ito yung mga activities at ito yung mga nagawa niyo na. At tas yung mga cells na red, yun yung mga hindi pa nagagawa. Tas nakita ko yung pangalan ng kaibigan ng anak ko, ang daming hindi nagagawa. Parang halos lahat ng assignment hindi pa nagagawa. So, like as a parent, what should I do? Should I tell my son na, Nak, iwasan mo na yung classmate mo na yan, ha? Baka hindi maganda impluensya sa'yo. Kasi hindi ko magawa na assignment. Baka, or, ang sinabi ko na lang, anak, impluensyahan mo siya, ha, na gumawa ng assignment. No, but what should a parent do? Kasi parang, like, do we go to that length na pipili tayo ng kakaibiganin ng mga anak natin? Parang ganun ba ang dating?
It's a really nice point. If you see your son having a friend who may not be turning in their assignments on time, should you go to that length that you tell your son, anak, mukhang you need to choose a new set of friends or a new best friend? I wouldn't go that length, but it made me think a lot. Siguro one thing that I would do is to see this over time and see if these are not happening one-off, although they could. But I think that to observe this over time would be my first step, siguro. I would want to know how they're interacting and whether my son is being influenced already, and I would know by checking his submission on the requirements. But I will have the same concern, siguro, especially after learning this research na parang, ganun pala yun. To draw some caution to those findings, I would say that we should also take it with some grain of salt na we have to not jump the gun and you say, oh my goodness, the friends of my kid or the friends of my brother are like this. I should stop it because it can influence them and they don't know about it. I would draw caution in that and say that observe over time. But there's also a concept of too late. And so for that concept, I would say maybe teach my son or someone I know, in this case, yung anak mo, Sir Rene, to maybe teach him some research on Contagion and say that, the people that you are with would actually have impact on your outcomes. And by that knowledge, and like I said, I think I mentioned this to you too on the preparation for this podcast, was if your son is actually so disciplined and diligent, the contagion can also happen bidirectionally, in that friend of your son might even thank your son because of your son, he's more diligent. Kasi it can happen both ways.
So,
yun siguro ang saving grace ng Contagion.
Yun na nga lang ang sinabi ko sa kanya. Well, yung sinabi mo na I shared with him na that's the case. So sabi ko, anak, the people we surround ourselves with has an influence on us. Kaya ikaw, dapat influensyahan mo yung classmate mo. Email mo siya, sabi mo mag-submit na siya ng assignment. Kasi knowing na parang bi-directional nga naman ang social contagion. So hopefully, maging good influence yung anak ko sa kaibigan niya.
Parenting 101.
Pero interesting yung yung case na yun. Pero yung single case ba, yung an individual ba is enough para mag-cause ng social contagion or kailangan isang gang sila?
You can conceptualize contagion. Pwede siyang ma-conceptualize na group onto an individual or individual to another individual. Both could be parang argued to be true. Especially pagka sinusulat yung papel, if this is a research paper, you can argue for both. I would say, however, that I would side on kahit one person to another. I would already count that as contagion. It just so happened that quantitatively, they would want to see group level effects. They would want to see a larger group influencing an individual. That's what can convince quantitative people that indeed the effects occur and the effects happen. Pero conceptually, I think both are true. And to me, kahit 1:1 lang, practically actionable type of contagion na yun.
Now, let's talk about mechanisms. No? Ano yung mga possible mechanisms dito sa social contagion? Kanina, we've talked about a few possible mechanisms, like for example, informational social influence, which is also kind of the case with the emotional kind of contagion. But are there other possible mechanisms that you suspect might provide logical explanation to social contagion?
Right. Those are always the content of the discussions of the papers that we write, because we need to be able to argue why so. And so one of the main reasons that we argued was from, of course, the more biological standpoint, because regardless of culture, meron tayong neurons, and neurons have some mirror neurons, in that what we see is something that is reflected through our brain. And so there's a corresponding neural network that responds to what we see. And so that's essentially a very strong mechanism that can definitely trigger or mechanistically make contagion happen. Second would be more social cognitive mechanisms. Bandura has mentioned observational learning. And so when we see in the context of our social environment, for example, a kid who, I'm sure you would know this, Rene, yung pag may bata na nagtututo ng magsalita ng, bad words because they just heard their parents say that word over and over and again. It's in a specific context and they're likely to copy that. So that's a more mechanism na medyo social. Another mechanism would be the ones that we've touched on a bit, yung conformity, that's a mechanism. Attention is another mechanism. So when we see it triggers a lot of the mechanisms na nabanggit na kanina. And one more interesting mechanism that we found was when we talk about yung work avoidance paper namin ni Dr. Ronel. I argued doon na for work avoidance to happen, I should see my environment to be avoiding activities, and then I in turn would also avoid school activities. Why? What's the mechanism? And we argued in that paper that when you don't know what to do, we call that the disinhibitory state. When you don't know what to do, whether to engage on the task or not, that puts you in a very vulnerable place for social contagion of work avoidance to happen. Why? Because at this moment, you're undecided, essentially. You have not yet determined your goal. So essentially, you don't know what to choose. You don't know what to do. As comparison to someone who learned about the goal and said, I will do it, right? Those others naman who said, I'm also sure I wouldn't do it. Itong hindi niya pa alam, the one that's hesitating, would likely tilt towards the not doing. Why? Because it's easier that way, at least in the short term. Because avoiding and disengaging from a school task is essentially reinforcing in the short term, because who is not reinforced by the removal of a stressor, diba? So that is the easier route. And so we always have posed that as one of the critical mechanisms of work avoidance contagion. So in short, there are so many mechanisms that we can name, some of them biological in nature, some of them psychological, and some of them contextual. In that case, pag hindi ka sure, you're likely to just follow the crowd.
So sa mga nakikinig ngayon, take note of those possible mechanisms. Perhaps you can do some kind of a mediation model to test out some of those possible mechanisms. Although medyo challenging yung iba, like for example, yung mirror neurons, mukhang kailangan natin ng mga mas sophisticated na instrumentation para matest yung model na yan.
Ako nga nag-iisip ako ng parang evolutionary framework where to put yung social contagion. Kasi it's possible na just by thinking about it, we can easily think na kailangan siya for survival, di ba? And maybe we can tease out the difference between conformity and social contagion kung nasa evolutionary perspective siya. Kasi people in a very large number, I cannot say na contagion yun parang kung very large yung number ng people and then you follow parang conformity yun, di ba? Parang social contagion is parang nasa mid-level ng number ng people na influencing each other. So I don't know if it helps to look at it that way or if it can help you to further parang theorize what are the parameters of social contagion versus other mechanisms like conformity.
Definitely. Kasi parang right now, the line that separates contagion, conformity, influence are still so blurry. And I think using specific theories, for example, evolutionary theory, and other applicable theories can help parang malinawan ng kaunti. Kailan siya ganito, kailan naman siya hindi. And I think that would be really the frontier of the future work necessary to be done on social contagion research. I definitely agree, Sir Darren. I hope this could also create that conversation on creating new researches that could do exactly this. Kasi medyo rigorous yung requirement niya on the data na parang it has to have at least 30 clusters, it has to have at least 20 to 30 students in each cluster, and then there has to be multiple time points, time 1 and time 2, at least dun sa study na ginawa namin. So there's a lot of data requirements to do it. And then, not to mention, yun nga Sir Darren, when you incorporate and integrate critical theories to use as lens in dissecting and fleshing out the contagion.
As researchers, ayaw natin yung nai-scoop tayo, no? Ayaw natin yung nauunahan tayo sa ating mga research ideas. But if there are some potential direction for future research that you are willing to share to those who are listening, as ano sa palagay mo yung mga exciting things or exciting unanswered questions, no, in the area of social contagion?
I'm on the other side of the coin. I'm on the side where research ideas should be shared even if someone has to do it before you. Because I think not everyone have time to pursue their ideas. So you have to put your ideas out there so one can run away with it and do it. One thing that has always been in my book, because I just have the data to do it, is to examine, wala pa kasing gumagawa, except for one but very crude, achievement contagion, which means does your classmates' grades influence yours? And I have time 1, time 2 data set of achievement. And I even have a mid-time point measuring basic psychological needs. So my theory is if the achievement of my classmates in time 1 influence mine in time 2, controlling for my time 1 achievement, which is contagion, gagawa ko ng mediation model, just like what you said kanina, Sir Rene, and I would put relatedness, autonomy, and competence as mediator. And my theorizing is that the grades or the achievement of your classmates around you satisfy your competence needs. Like, I'm surrounded with people who are good. And because I'm surrounded with people who are good, that motivates me to perform better. And so my grades increase as a response to that environment. So I wanted to test that model, which has been written and rewritten in this book. So I would cite Eos Trinidad, who is studying PhD in University of Chicago. Sabi niya, leave something for after your PhD. And I'm like, okay. I agree. So that's one interesting research. Another research I would recommend would be maraming research on social contagion and social influence is happening in Germany, somewhere in the West, specifically Frenzel, as an author from Germany, studying how the maths and science motivation of teachers influence their students. So this is even more interesting now. And so tinitignan naman nila ngayon, transmission from the teacher to the student. And Dr. Runel, I know, is doing something about this too, although more from the mental health side. I think they published in Child Indicators Research something about this. So I feel that not only among your peers, so we should be thinking about maybe parents to children, boss to employee. There's a lot of research on that. Merong burnout engagement, meron ding work engagement. So yung lieutenant nung mga nagtatrabaho as sergeants may transmissible din doon. And so not solely on the construct, the psychological construct of you want to investigate contagion with. I think maganda rin tignan yung mga entities, the individuals surrounding that. You can also do this, Sir Darren, I'm sure you're thinking about, applying this in the context of religion. I'm sure that's a really important part as well. And so there are many ways to splice it. And so yung mga ideas ko recently, if it's in school, does the grades of the friends of my son affect his? That's one question. Teacher to student. Meron pa silang ginagawa ngayon, sir, medyo mas complex na, which I would not even touch, is principal level, teacher level, and then student level, 3-level, multi-level modeling. And to me, that's already where I would say I would have to expand on to another research idea, because that gets to the point where you will just be a geek once you analyze those data.
All right, so we're nearing the end of our podcast. Siguro, maybe you can talk a bit about implications. Like, what have you learned from your studies, and what do you think can be realistically applied in terms of our day-to-day living, or maybe at the level of educational institutions? What are some of possible notable implications that can be drawn from the current research?
I think na-mention na natin, although pahapyaw lang kanina, yung parents need to be aware, about the social environment of their kids. I think age-old wisdom naman yun, and sometimes it's an instinct that you care about who your children go with and play with and spend most of their time with. So that's important. But also it's important to let go of that sometimes, and you have to trust your kid sometimes. And so you educate the kid that I'm not gonna stop you from befriending X and Y, but I need to let you know that befriending X and Y will have impacts on you, whether you know it or not. And that level of certainty with uncertainty, which is really nice, helps the kid kind of understand, okay, my dad just cares about me. That's why he tells me this, but he doesn't want to control me, because we know that controlling parenthood is not effective. So that's one implication. Another implication I would say is when we think about contagion is among employees as well. So we need to know that emotions, burnout, especially pandemic, burnout, these are all happening maybe subtly, hindi na natin sila napapansin. And so these are all mechanisms that if you know about social contagion, you have to be aware. So I've always said you have to be aware. And so I think that people need to learn more about how to be more mindful of their thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. And so we have to have the ability to notice and peg a specific reason for our behaviors. Kasi one thing that separates us from many other species is our ability to be rational and our ability to think ahead. So we need to be aware, why am I like this? Why am I thinking this? Why am I doing this? And if the answer to that is true, although sometimes you can be deceived because we're humans, we have to be aware. And kasi so I think it's important that we are mindful of the goal pursuits, behavioral or emotional or cognitive. The behaviors that we have to be able to know why we do them. Kasi I've mentioned awareness several times over that implication question by Sir Rene. And I think with the knowledge of social contagion, if you're the individual who is very susceptible to the people around you, you have to be able to know when you engage in a thought, a feeling, or even a behavior. You have to be able to peg a reason for that. Not that you always have to, but it always need to be clear to yourself bakit ito yung pinapursue mo. For example, if you really want to do well in school, why is that? And if it's only driven because everyone in your class is doing it, then one could say that maybe is a function of social contagion. But if, because your values is to make your parents proud, or you really want to land a job, you need to use your academic credentials to do well in life after school, and that's really your goal, that's really your value, then one can argue that even if your classmates are performing well, that is not the sole reason for you to be doing well. And that also applies for negative outcomes, depression, anxiety, stress, burnout in the workplace. Those are all transmissible. There's evidence for that. And so when we decide, kailangan merong mindfulness. And so I think one implication I really think is now more than ever, we need to be doing some mindfulness exercises. It's just a few minutes of the day, although sometimes I would say that I'm also missing it, even if I know that if you do it first thing in the morning, that really propels you for the whole day. Even random moments in the day, you don't have to really be full on 10 minutes, but if there are moments where you catch yourself doing something or thinking about something and you ask yourself why, that is a mindful moment enough that can separate you from those who may be not as mindful. So I think that is one strong implication. Medyo hindi sa research implication, but it's more of like a self-help implication that I apply to myself too. And awareness of why I pursue things.
All right, thank you very much, Norman. So that's it. Marami tayong natutunan ngayong gabi about social contagion. Maraming mga potential research ideas and maraming mga possible implications. So magpapasalamat tayo kay Norman for being our guest for tonight. And hopefully in the future, ma-invite uli namin siya to talk about his other research interest. Darren?
Thank you, Norman. And syempre, sana lagi tayong okay. But other than that, maganda yung message of maintaining our awareness, being thoughtful about things, no? Kahit na minsan din naman natin magagawa yun palagi. But on the practical level, if you have opportunity, then do it. Better if you can do it more regularly. Yan. So thank you, Norman.
I appreciate the invitation, Sir Rene and Sir Darren. I would also take this opportunity to thank you both kasi I think this conversation to this episode was a few weeks, if not a month ago, kaso elections and everything is happening. So I really appreciate you having me here.
All right, so that's it for our podcast. We will see you in the next. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.